Okay, can everybody hear me? So this mic is working. Okay, so I'm very happy to be here. Thanks to the organizers for inviting me. I want to talk about complex relationships between family structure and poverty. And I'm going to talk about the data I'm going to share with you, and a lot of the ideas come from my own work, which is domestically oriented. But as Heinz suggested to me, the US is on the globe too. So we can talk about problems in our own backyard, as well as problems that maybe are a little bit further away. I want to acknowledge before I get started that almost everything I'm going to talk about today is based on collaborative work with Dan Meyer. So I want to try to cover three things. First, I want to talk about a simple view of families and poverty and their connection. And I'm really not trying to build a straw man to tear down. I'm really trying to share with you a way that many of us think about this problem. And then I'm going to talk about why maybe we want to think about it differently. I'm going to spend most of my time talking about a case for complexity. And one of the things I want to emphasize here is that the problem is complicated and the solutions are complicated, but I do not mean intractable. I mean interesting. Okay, complicated in an interesting way. There are a lot of pieces to this puzzle, and there are some really kind of fun things to think about. And then I'm going to end with some implications for multidisciplinary research agenda. And here I'm going to kind of try to suggest a few things, but I really am trying to kind of just give you a sense of some of the things I know are important that I don't know about, that I hope most of you all know about, and you can add to those pieces. So here's my simple world, a simple view. First comes love, then comes marriage, then children in a baby carriage, right? So this is an economist's artistic rendering of a family. There's a father, there's a mother, there's two children that they have in common. And you'll see at the bottom of the slide that I've noted that 11% of children that live in households headed by a married couple are poor, and you might, in the United States. And you might think, wow, that's really bad. So the bad news is that's the good news, okay? An alternative would be when parents don't live together. So here's my artistic rendering of a family where the mother and the father live in separate households. That's why you have a little dotted line there. They still have two children that are their children in common, but they don't live together. In most cases, those children will live with the mother. In 44% of those cases, the children will be poor by the official standard of poverty. That is to say, more than 4 out of 10 children who live in mother-headed families are poor in the United States. So it sounds like we have, in many ways, a simple problem and a simple solution. If the problem is that children that live in single-mother families are 4 times more likely to be poor, and they're actually 6 times more likely to live in extreme poverty, that is, below half the poverty line, then it seems like a good solution would be just to make sure that people stay married, or at least get married before they have kids. And I notice a few people chuckling in the background. I hate to say that this is actually the focus of a fair amount of serious academic literature, and quite a bit of popular press, and a non-trivial investment by the federal government in marriage promotion. So while it might seem silly to many of us, it is in fact the idea that goes behind a lot of proposals that are out there. So I'm going to argue that this simple solution is neither simple nor a solution. And I'm going to make 2 kind of main arguments about that. One is that changes in marriage, fertility, and work, sounds like my bio, okay, those are the things I study, are related in complicated ways. And because of the ways in which they're related, it's not so simple just to get people to get married to solve the problem. I'm also going to argue that this simple solution is not simple or a solution because restoring us to a period of traditional family would be such a radical change. I think a more radical change than many of us realize. So on the first, why are changes, what do I mean when I say that changes in marriage and fertility and work are related in complex ways? Well, if you asked me to give a 1-minute version of the hour-long lecture I often give, I would say that the ways in which families have changed in the last 50 years could be characterized by less and later marriage, so fewer people are marrying, and they're marrying later in the life course. They're having fewer children, they're having them later in the life course, and they're more often having them outside of the context of marriage. And I would say that employment for men and women is converging. Men are still more likely to work than women. They still earn more than women on average, but the difference between the employment and earnings of men and women has converged. When you take all three of these things together, their impact has not been very great in terms of poverty. On the one hand, less marriage, all else equal, has increased poverty. On the other hand, more women and more mothers working, all else equal, has reduced poverty, because those single mother families actually used to be poorer than they are today, because fewer of those mothers had family-sustaining jobs. And also, having fewer children has reduced poverty, because those single moms or those married couples are supporting fewer children. So when you take all three of those changes together, the effect on poverty hasn't been particularly great. So the problem behind a policy solution saying, let's just have people get married and hold all else equal, is that all else wouldn't remain equal. And in particular, there's a strong connection between fewer and shorter marriages and more employment among women. Now, sociologists and economists have spent 30 to 40 years trying to figure out what direction this relationship goes in, okay? So is it the case that women are less likely to drop out of the labor market when they get married because they don't think that marriage is permanent? Or is that marriage less likely to be permanent because women are more economically dependent and they're more able to leave a bad marriage? Well, clearly it's a little bit of both. So figuring out how much of either explanation is a difficult task empirically. Similarly, women working more and women earning more is connected. Because women stay in the labor market more consistently, they're able to move into jobs that are more career jobs and higher paying jobs. On the other hand, because women are in those kinds of jobs, there's more of a penalty to them leaving them, and they stay working more. See? So it goes in both directions. So the point that I'm trying to make here is just increasing marriage isn't really a sensible thing to talk about, because if all of a sudden marriages were long-lasting and stable, you'd also see a decline in women's work, you'd see an increase in fertility, so you'd see other changes that would be poverty increasing. Perhaps the more important reason why increasing marriage as a solution to poverty doesn't really make a lot of sense is because restoring a traditional family model would be a totally radical change. And I think people understand that kind of intuitively, but I don't know how much people kind of see just how much things have changed in the last 40 or 50 years. So I'm going to give you one example. In 1960, 5% of children in the United States were born outside of married families. That would be about 1 in 20. In 2009, the latest year for which data are available, 41% of children were born to unmarried parents. So that's not the kids who end up in single-parent families because of a divorce. Those are the children who begin life born to unmarried parents. Sometimes those parents are living together. On average, those living together situations last for less than 2 years. So these children will almost certainly spend most of their childhood living in a single-parent family, or at least not living with both of their biological parents. So we have, just for the demographer in me, one mom, one dad, one sibship, that is, children who share the same parents, and 2 households in this picture. In many cases, this situation results in more complicated families. This is a mom who again has 2 children, but she's had those children with 2 different fathers, okay? In this case, we have 1 mom, 2 dads, 2 sibships, okay? These children share a mom in common, but not the same father, and 3 households. And in some cases, these families get very complicated. In particular, you'll see this is a mom who's had children with 2 fathers, and one of those fathers has had a child with another mother. And I'm not looking at the fertility of that second mother who's off right there, so I'm not counting her fertility. So I'm saying, oops. I'm saying 1 mom, because it's 1 focal mom, and I'll show you why in a minute. I'm going to show you some data on this. 2 dads, 3 sibships, 4 households. All of these people could be in contact with one another. So these complicated families raise a host of issues for the kinds of things that I care about, for social policies. They have a lot to do with things like welfare benefits, social security benefits, child support, income taxes. Think about the New Badger Partnership or any of our plans for having scholarships. And look at this picture and tell me, for this child right here, who's relevant to determining whether that child needs financial aid? Do you just care about their biological parents? What about that mother's other responsibilities to this child? Are those offset by this father? How about this father? Is it just his income? Or do we want to take into account that he has a child in another household? What about this mother's resources relative to this father? Okay? So pretty much anything you want to think about that we have in our head, a family is a mother and a father and their children in common, gets a lot more complicated when you have these kinds of family structures. Now, this raises measurement issues, which the kind of demographer junkie in me likes. A lot of interesting questions. Think about fielding a survey of families and who's giving what to whom if you have a family like that. But the practical importance of this topic really depends on the incidence. So if those complicated families are 1 in 100 families, then it's, interesting intellectually, but not very important from a policy standpoint. So with that in mind, Dan Meyer and I undertook a few years ago to gather data from essentially birth records in Wisconsin for the entire state of Wisconsin. So I want to emphasize here, this isn't low-income families, this isn't a particular region of Wisconsin. It's essentially all the non-marital births in Wisconsin, and I just told you that about a little over 40% of all births are non-marital. So that's a pretty big part of the population. And if you look at these births, what we did is, to make our numbers as conservative as possible, we started with mothers who were having their first child. So by definition, those moms don't have a complicated family yet, because it's their first kid. You can only have your first kid with one father, right? But those kids, in about 20% of the cases, the father had an obligation, a legal obligation that we could observe in the records that we had to another child. If you go all the way down to when this firstborn child was 10 years old, what you'll see is that more than 60% of these children lived in complicated families. And they were about evenly split among those who had the father, their biological father had children with another mother. Their biological mother had a child with another father who was probably living in their same household. Or about 20% of the cases that were that most complicated picture that I showed you, which is to say at least their mother had children with at least one other father, and their biological father had legal obligations to at least one other mother. And these data, for a host of technical reasons, are actually quite conservative. We only have a record of legal obligations that appear in court proceedings and other things. So there are lots of complications we don't see, but any complication that's here is real. We estimate that probably this should be about 75% of these children actually live in complicated families if we could observe all the fertility, okay? So that answers the question of, do we have to pay attention? I would say yes, if 40% of children are born to non-married parents, and if 3/4 of those children are going to end up in complicated families by the time they're 10, then we need to actually pay attention to this. So, conclusions, before Jake even gives me the 5-minute mark. So, my conclusions are that the relationship between family structure and poverty is complex, that family resources and needs are complex and dynamic. Okay, so that last picture showed you kind of the evolution over time of people's, so you don't necessarily start in a complicated family, and then maybe your father has another relationship, and then your mother has another relationship, and those relationships might tax the resources. They might bring new resources into the household, right? So it's not clear that whether these are good things or bad things, okay? And defining the boundaries of family is very difficult. So biological family is one thing, social family is another thing, and one of the things that I think I've really struggled with as a social scientist and as a policy person is, what's the relevant definition of family? And as I work in multidisciplinary settings with people who have a different frame, who are really focused on the biological, or are really focused on the legal, or are really focused on the social, all of which are important, but which we tend to think are all the same, and in the contemporary context often aren't. So that's one issue. Then the other one is that marriage and fertility and work, which are things I talked about, but also time and health and care resources and power are all related to one another. And so often our temptation, especially in our individual disciplines, is to think about one thing. What if I promote marriage? What if I change the educational resources? What if I require people to work? And we don't necessarily think about what those changes, what implications they will have in other spheres. And I think that's clearly important. And then finally, that policy options that we face, in considering policy options, because I'm fundamentally about trying to change things, so I'm interested in what the implications are for policy, we have to think about that I think often policy can respond to some situations, but it might not be able to shape it. So in terms of family change, I would ask you to think with some caution about any proposal that someone gives you for how they're going to change the rules and get people to make different decisions about whether to have a child or get married, which is different from changing the rules to respond to people having started to make different decisions about having children or getting married. So I think policy is often much more successful at responding to social and demographic change than it is to shaping that social and demographic change. And finally, I would say an important caution is that low-income populations are much more vulnerable to policy. And I mean that in two very different ways, and maybe this will be a segue into Heinz's remarks. One way in which poor populations are more vulnerable is that low-income families, if we change a policy and take something away or impose something on them, they have many fewer degrees of freedom to substitute, to figure out a different way to do it. So if we make a cut in a program, if the quality of the schools decline for a middle-class family, they have a different set of options than if the quality of schools changes for a poor family. The other way in which low-income families are much more vulnerable to policy change is somehow when we're thinking about policies that are acceptable for low-income populations, our mind wanders more broadly often, I find, than when we think about policies that might be acceptable for the middle class. So in thinking about marriage promotion, I think we got some of the policy recommendations that we did out of Washington because we had in mind poor people who didn't really understand what they should be doing. And if you think about imposing those same restrictions or conditions on your neighbors, in a middle-class neighborhood at least, you would be maybe a little more cautious about their feasibility. So I'm just going to end here, which is to say my focus is on this final thing, children's social, emotional, and economic resources. They're clearly influenced by family structure. Who's in the household, where they're living, what the legal marital status, biological, the level of conflict, all those things. But that family exists in a much broader context. And I think understanding the interplay and the ways in which that broader context shapes family formation and in turn children's outcomes is really important. Thank you.